The night wrapped the small Ohio house in deep silence, the kind that made every sound feel louder than it was, and Margaret Hale slept lightly, caught between dreams and memory, when a faint noise slipped into her rest like a ripple across still water, not loud enough to frighten her but strong enough to pull her from sleep, a sound that felt personal, intentional, as if someone had reached into the dark to touch her name, and she turned slowly in bed, her heart already beating faster before her mind understood why. The clock glowing 2:07 a.m., the hallway beyond her bedroom thick with shadows, and then it came again, a knock, soft but certain, followed by a pause that carried weight, and Margaret sat up, breath held, thoughts racing through practical fears, mistake, emergency, stranger, but none of them fit the strange calm mixed with dread rising in her chest, so she stood, slipped into her robe, and walked toward the door with careful steps, each one stirring the past she kept neatly folded away during daylight hours, and when she opened the door the porch light revealed a face she knew better than her own reflection, older than she remembered yet unmistakable, eyes tired, jaw tense, a travel bag hanging from one hand as if he had come straight from the road without stopping to think. "Mom," Daniel said, voice quiet and unsure, and in that single word years collapsed. The house filled with echoes of childhood mornings and late-night talks, but this was not one of those times. Because Daniel did not visit without warning, not anymore, not since his life had moved north to Toronto, and Margaret felt the shift instantly, the sense that something had broken its rules to bring him here now. She stepped aside to let him in, the smell of cold air and highway dust following him inside, and he looked around the living room as if checking that it still existed, that she still did. "I tried calling," he added, setting the bag down, "but you didn't answer, and—" Margaret nodded, unable to explain that she had been asleep, that sleep had been the problem, because moments before his knock she had been dreaming, deeply, vividly, the kind of dream that leaves a person breathless upon waking, where faces are clear and voices feel close enough to touch, a dream she did not want to name out loud, because it belonged to a part of her life she had locked away with care. Daniel followed her into the kitchen, his presence filling the space with concern and quiet urgency. And as she turned on the light she noticed his hands shaking just slightly, noticed how his eyes lingered on her face longer than usual, searching for signs she had learned to hide. "I just had a feeling," he said, not meeting her gaze. "I couldn't sleep, and it felt wrong not to come," and she wanted to reassure him, to tell him she was fine, that nothing had changed, but her voice failed her, because something had changed, not in the house, not in her health, but inside her, stirred awake by a dream that had reached across decades to remind her of a woman she once was, and as she poured water into the kettle she realized her hands were trembling too. Daniel watched her closely now, sensing the truth hovering just beneath the surface, and the kettle began to hum, filling the silence with sound, giving them both something to hold on to, but Margaret felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected, as if sleep had loosened a knot she spent her waking hours tightening, and Daniel had arrived at the exact moment her guard was down, the dream still lingering in her mind like warmth after a fire has gone out. She busied herself with cups and tea bags, aware of his eyes following her movements, aware of the questions he wasn't asking yet, and when she finally turned back to him she saw not just her grown son but the boy who once crawled into her bed after nightmares, trusting her to protect him from things he couldn't see, and the irony struck her sharply, because now she was the one haunted, and Daniel was standing here because some unseen part of him had sensed it. "Mom," he said softly, "are you okay?" And the simple kindness of the question almost broke her. She forced a smile, nodded again, said she was just tired, but the word felt thin, fragile, unable to hold the truth behind it. The kettle clicked off, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen, and as she poured the water she realized that whatever she had been dreaming, whatever name she had whispered into the dark, had reached beyond her own heart, had crossed the miles and drawn her son back home in the middle of the night. And as they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, steam rising between them, Margaret understood that this visit was not an accident, that sleep had opened a door she had kept closed for years, and Daniel's arrival was only the beginning of what waited on the other side. Margaret stirred the tea in her cup, feeling its warmth through her hands, trying to steady her racing thoughts as Daniel sat across from her, quiet but watchful, his eyes reflecting a mix of concern and curiosity that made her stomach twist with unease, because she knew he had come not just out of worry but out of a sense that something was off, something unspoken that he couldn't ignore. and while he didn't immediately ask questions, the air between them carried a tension that made every small movement feel significant, the clink of a spoon against ceramic, the hiss of steam from the teapot, every noise amplified in the late-night silence, and she could feel her own secret brushing at the edges of her mind, a name she had whispered in her sleep just minutes before, a name that belonged to a life she had hidden under careful layers of memory, a past filled with love she had never shared with anyone, and Daniel's gaze, steady and patient, seemed to draw it out from the shadows, as if he could sense the pulse of her heart and the hidden ache she had carried for decades, and Margaret wanted to divert, to talk about the weather, the drive, the long hours of his job in Toronto, anything that would prevent the truth from spilling into the room, but she knew it was too late, that sleep had betrayed her and that he had heard more than she realized, because he shifted in his chair, leaning forward just slightly, voice low and careful, "Mom, who is Thomas?" And the cup rattled in her hand as the world narrowed to that single question. Thomas, the first love she had buried, the man whose letters she had written but never sent, whose memory had lived quietly in the corners of her life while she built a family, a home, a life that was safe but incomplete, and Margaret's chest tightened as she realized that the dream had spoken the name aloud, a whisper she hadn't meant to share, and now it hung between them, fragile yet undeniable, Daniel's voice soft but insistent, full of curiosity mixed with the vulnerability of a son who had grown up thinking he knew everything about his mother, yet suddenly faced with a depth of her past that was entirely unknown, and she swallowed hard, words sticking in her throat, the kettle cooling beside her, and she finally exhaled, telling him slowly, carefully, about Thomas Reed, about a love that had been passionate and all-consuming but impossible at the time, about how she had chosen a different path, married Daniel's father, had him, built a life that was full yet always missing a piece, and as she spoke, memories rose in her mind like waves, letters written in faint ink, afternoons spent walking through parks imagining a life she never took, moments of laughter and longing, all resurfacing in vivid detail, and Daniel listened, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable for a moment, then softening as he understood that this was not a story of betrayal but of human longing, of choices made under the weight of circumstance, and Margaret felt a mixture of relief and fear, relief that he hadn't recoiled, fear that he would now see her as someone fragile, someone who had loved outside the boundaries of her life, and she tried to reassure him, saying that it didn't change anything about their life together, their family, but Daniel shook his head gently. "I found the letters," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "When I came in tonight, they were under your bed," and Margaret's heart skipped, the proof of her secret now in his hands even if he hadn't physically touched it, the vulnerability laid bare by her sleep and by his unexpected visit. And she realized that the darkest part of her past had shifted from a hidden shame to a tender truth, something that could now be acknowledged, shared, and perhaps understood, and she saw in Daniel's eyes not judgment but empathy, the kind that comes from seeing a loved one's pain and longing without resentment, and it struck her that in all these years she had feared exposure, had feared that revealing her heart's memory would fracture the safe world she had built, but here, in the middle of the night, with tea cooling on the table and shadows stretching across the walls, she felt something new, connection, the bridge between past and present opening in a gentle way, and Daniel reached across, hand hovering near hers, a silent gesture of comfort, a promise that her secret would not destroy their bond. "You're allowed to still feel," he said softly, "you're allowed to want," and Margaret blinked, tears rising unbidden, realizing that the love she had hidden, the longing she had carried, the letters she had written and kept secret, were not sins or mistakes but pieces of herself that deserved acknowledgement, and for the first time in decades, she felt seen, fully, by the one person whose understanding mattered most. Yet beneath the warmth of their reunion, a question lingered like the last note of a song, the dream, Thomas appearing in her subconscious now. Why had he come back to her mind tonight? What was it that her heart was trying to tell her? And as the kettle sat silent and the room held a quiet gravity, Margaret understood that the night was far from over, that sleep had loosened her guard, Daniel's visit had drawn out her story, and what lay ahead could reshape not just her memories but the possibilities of her heart in ways she could not yet predict, and the air between mother and son pulsed with unspoken truths, a mix of relief, worry, and a fragile hope, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the steam from her tea curling between her and Daniel, and felt The weight of silence pressing on them both, a silence full of questions neither had yet voiced but both understood, because now that the name Thomas had been spoken and the letters discovered, there was no going back to ordinary conversation, and Daniel's eyes held a mixture of wonder, confusion, and a strange tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache with a feeling she hadn't expected, the kind that comes from being seen completely, without pretense, and she realized that what she had always thought of as her private sorrow, the love she had buried so deeply, was no longer hers alone to carry, that her son, grown, thoughtful, patient, had now stepped into that part of her life, aware, witnessing, and ready to hold it without judgment, and she could feel the years of restraint, of careful living, of measured choices, pressing against her ribs as if her heart were trying to escape, so she spoke, haltingly at first, telling him of Thomas Reed, of a love that had been bright, consuming, and impossible, of letters written in secret, of afternoons walking through memories she had never shared, of the longing that never quite faded, and Daniel listened, leaning slightly forward, fingers clasped, nodding occasionally, letting the words wash over him without interruption, and in that listening she felt the walls she had built around her heart start to crumble, piece by piece, letting the vulnerability she had carried for decades become real, palpable, no longer a secret, no longer hidden under careful layers of time. And then Daniel, soft but firm, told her that he had found the letters when he arrived, and the moment the words left his mouth, Margaret's stomach dropped and her throat tightened, because she realized that the past she had protected so carefully was now in his hands, yet his tone held no reproach, no accusation, only quiet acknowledgement, and she understood that this was not exposure to shame but exposure to truth, and in the truth, there was a strange liberation, a way to breathe more freely than she had in years. And Daniel reached out across the table, hand hovering near hers, a gesture of empathy that made her blink back tears she hadn't expected to shed, and he said gently, "You're allowed to still feel. You're allowed to want," words that carried both acceptance and encouragement, and in them Margaret felt the warmth of love in its simplest, most human form, a bond that transcended decades and mistakes, a bond that recognized longing as natural, inevitable, beautiful even, and she nodded, barely able to speak because the relief of being understood overwhelmed her, because for so long she had believed that the heart's true desires were to be hidden, kept under lock and key, but here they were. In the middle of the night, in a kitchen filled with soft light and the quiet sound of the house breathing around them, and she realized that the darkness she had feared had vanished, replaced by the courage to admit that life had left her with choices and regrets but also with memories that were hers to cherish, to honor, to explore perhaps even again, and Daniel, still listening, still patient, still tender, made her feel that the love she had once known was not gone, merely paused, and that acknowledgement alone could bring it back into life in new ways, ways that didn't diminish her family, her son, the life she had built, but added depth, richness, and the possibility of rediscovery. And as the minutes stretched, filled with quiet conversation, glances, and unspoken understanding, Margaret began to see that her past love was not a threat but a bridge, connecting the woman she had been with the woman she still could become, and Daniel, sensing the shift, smiled faintly, a smile that carried reassurance and gentle curiosity, and Margaret felt her chest tighten, a mix of fear and hope, because the letters, the dreams, the whispered name, they were no longer private, no longer hidden under the bed, and yet instead of shame, she felt an unexpected freedom, the kind that comes from having someone who truly sees you, and she realized that this was a moment she had never expected, the unplanned intersection of past and present, mother and son, longing and truth, and in that room, filled with quiet warmth, she felt the extraordinary normalcy of being human, of loving, of making mistakes, of having a heart that still held room for what was lost but not forgotten, and then, as if reading her thoughts, Daniel said softly, almost to himself, "Mom, it's okay. You don't have to hide anything from me," and the words fell over her like sunlight breaking through clouds, and she laughed softly, a sound of relief and recognition, because she realized that in all these years she had feared judgment, exposure, misunderstanding, yet here it was, not condemnation but compassion, and that changed everything, that changed how she saw herself, how she saw the night, how she saw the possibility of what the future might hold, even for a love she had once thought impossible, and the tension in her shoulders loosened as she leaned back, tea forgotten for a moment, heart open, eyes misted with tears, knowing that the darkest corners of her memory were now safe, acknowledged, alive in a way they never had been, and she understood finally that the unexpected visit had done more than surprise her. It had shifted the balance of her life, brought her son closer, reminded her that longing was not weakness, and that the past, when shared, could become a source of intimacy, healing, and love. And as they sat together, quiet, connected, the night held them in its soft embrace, leaving Margaret with a fragile, growing hope that life might still have more beauty and more love to offer than she had allowed herself to believe. The first light of morning seeped through the curtains, soft and pale, washing the kitchen in a quiet glow, and Margaret sat at the table, letters clutched loosely in her hands, still warm from the night's revelations, the world outside slowly waking while inside, the house held a calm she had not felt in years, a stillness that carried both relief and the gentle ache of lingering questions. And Daniel slept on the couch, exhaustion finally overtaking him after the emotional intensity of the night, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts, which were swirling faster than ever, caught between memory and possibility, past and present, because the night had done more than reveal secrets, it had awakened truths, the kind that linger in your chest like the first spark of hope after a long winter. And as she sipped the now cooling tea, she thought of Thomas, of the letters, of the dreams that had whispered his name in her sleep, and realized that the fear she had carried for decades about being vulnerable, about love beyond what she had allowed herself, had begun to dissolve in the presence of her son's understanding and quiet compassion, and she smiled softly at the irony that an unexpected visit in the dead of night could shift a life so profoundly, reminding her that the heart's desires, even those long buried, were not meant to be hidden forever. And Margaret rose to move toward the window, watching the sunlight touch the edges of the trees and the quiet street, feeling a strange lightness in her chest as if she had been carrying a secret weight and had finally laid it down, and her mind wandered to possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine, a chance to reconnect with a love that had shaped her youth, that had lingered in her soul, not as a threat to the life she had built but as a reminder of the fullness of what it meant to be human, to love, to long, and to hope. And when Daniel stirred, stretching and yawning, she noticed the softness in his face, the way his presence had shifted the atmosphere from tension to quiet intimacy, a bond strengthened not by perfection but by truth, and he looked at her with a tentative smile, the kind that asked without words if she was ready for the world to continue, ready for life beyond the confessions of the night. And she realized he had not judged her, had not seen her past as a failure, but as a story, a rich and human story. And that realization brought warmth and tears she couldn't hold back, and as Daniel began to pack to rest before his long drive back, she felt the pang of letting go mixed with gratitude for what had passed, because their relationship had shifted, deepened, grown more honest, more real. And when he paused at the door, hand on the handle, he turned back and said gently, "Mom, promise me something?" And Margaret looked at him, heart full, and he added, "Don't let the rest of your life stay hidden under a bed." And the words struck her with both clarity and quiet courage, the kind that comes when someone you love affirms your right to live fully, without shame or fear. And she nodded, voice soft but sure, "I promise," knowing it was more than a promise to him, it was a promise to herself, to honor the love, the longing, the memories, and the possibilities still waiting. And as the door clicked behind him, leaving her in the warm, morning-lit house, she felt the stirring of hope like the first breath of spring, fragile but persistent, and she picked up the letters again, reading Thomas's name with new curiosity, daring, and a gentle heartbeat of excitement, and her fingers hovered over her phone, searching for the contact she had avoided for decades, typing and pausing, heart racing with anticipation, because the night had reminded her that love, even long buried, still had the power to wake her up, to inspire, to offer new beginnings. And Margaret understood that her darkest secret had not destroyed her, had not broken her, it had opened a door to honesty, to connection, and perhaps, to love again. And as she sat in the morning light, letters in hand, phone on the table, a sense of calm determination settled over her, knowing that the choices she had once made did not define the limits of her heart, that the past could coexist with the future, that longing could be acknowledged without shame, and that the unexpected visit had not been an intrusion but a gift, one that reminded her that life, even after years of careful walking, could still surprise, could still awaken, could still bring the chance for reconnection and fulfillment. And Margaret breathed in deeply, letting the quiet warmth fill her, feeling ready for the journey ahead, ready to embrace the heart she had once hidden, and ready to see what love, renewed and remembered, might bring.